The Arctic Convoys, the deadliest sea route on Earth. During World War II, to supply the Soviet Union, Allied ships braved freezing storms, icebergs, and relentless German U-boats through the Arctic Circle. The cold killed faster than bullets, but they sailed anyway. They called it the Murmansk Run, a voyage so deadly that even the sea seemed to hate men for daring it. From the decks of Allied ships, sailors looked out at an ocean that could kill without a single shot being fired. In winter, the air froze skin in seconds. In summer, the sun never set, leaving them exposed to the enemy 24 hours a day. Between 1941 and 1945, convoys of merchant and naval vessels carved their way through the Arctic Circle from Britain and Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, carrying vital war supplies to keep Stalin's armies fighting. Every ton of cargo meant another Russian soldier with a rifle, another tank rolling east, another chance to hold back Hitler's tide. But the price was unimaginable. Sub-zero storms, the ice was so thick that it crushed steel, U-boats hunting beneath the waves, and overhead the Luftwaffe's shadow circling like vultures waiting for the kill. More than 3,000 Allied sailors never came home. Their ships sank not in flames but in silence, swallowed by freezing black water where no human could survive for more than a few minutes. This is the story of the men who fought not just the enemy, but the ocean itself. This is the story of the Arctic Convoys, the deadliest sea route on Earth. Act 1. Frozen Lifelines. The convoys began not with glory, but with cold. Not the polite chill of a winter morning, but the kind of cold that slapped the soul clean out of your body. Sailors joked that you didn't breathe up there, you inhaled knives. From the Scottish lochs and Icelandic fjords, the ships gathered. Liberty ships, corvettes, destroyers, icebreakers, all loaded with crates marked "To Russia," with hope. Inside were Spitfires, Valentine tanks, Spam, boots, and a few thousand cigarettes smuggled past the quartermaster. Because if the Nazis didn't kill you, boredom might. The men called it the Suicide Run, but the Admiralty had a nicer name, Convoy PQ. Outbound ships were PQ, homebound were QP. A sailor quipped once, PQ stands for Pray Quickly, and QP stands for Quickly Pray. Nobody laughed too loud. Superstition was stronger than steel. In 1941, when the first convoys left, Churchill himself called it the most dangerous journey in the world. The route sliced above Norway, deep into the Arctic Circle, where the nights were eternal, and so were the enemies. The Germans waited with submarines and bombers, but nature was crueler still. The temperature could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, freezing lifeboats solid. Waves taller than houses crashed over decks, coating everything, including ice, men. When a sailor fell overboard, no one shouted, "Man overboard," anymore. They just said, "He's gone." Because by the time the words reached your lips, the sea had already claimed him. Convoy PQ-17 became a floating horror story. 35 ships set out from Iceland carrying tanks, guns, and dreams. Only 11 survived the journey. The rest were blown apart, frozen, or sunk under relentless U-boat attacks and Luftwaffe raids. Captain Jack Broom, who commanded the escort, once wrote in his log, quote, "The sea burned with oil, but the cold put out even the flames." End quote. Yet somehow, more convoys followed. Because each one that made it through meant thousands of Soviet soldiers would keep fighting, and the Eastern Front would not collapse. As one old British sailor later joked with grim pride, quote,
If Hitler had sent his army through the Arctic instead of Russia, they'd have surrendered by Murmansk." End quote. And with that kind of humor and a lot of tea, they sailed on.
Act 2. The Wolf Packs of the North. If the cold didn't kill you first, the wolves would. Not the four-legged kind, the ones that came from beneath the sea. They called them Rudel, the German U-boat wolf packs. Sleek, silent, and merciless, they stalked the Arctic convoys through black water and ice fog. To the Germans, the merchant ships were fat, slow-moving prey. To the sailors, the ocean was a haunted graveyard. They just hadn't found their tombstones yet. A U-boat commander once described the hunt like this: "They came in a line, their lights faint in the fog. We could smell their oil before we saw them." The Germans had every advantage. Their U-boats lurked along the Norwegian coast, guided by reconnaissance planes and radar. When the convoys entered the killing grounds, the wolves circled. And then, in the dead of night, they struck. Torpedoes cut through the sea with white trails that glowed like ghosts. When they hit, the explosions tore through hulls with a sound like the sky itself breaking open. Men were thrown into freezing water where survival time was counted in minutes. A young gunner on HMS Achates once joked grimly, "If I die, tell my mother I finally took a bath." No one laughed, but everyone remembered. The British escorts fought back with everything they had: depth charges, sonar sweeps, flares that turned the night red. The ocean became a deadly chessboard, with life and death decided by pings and echoes. For every U-boat sunk, two more appeared. The Germans called it Operation Russelsprung, Knight's Move. The Allies called it what it was: bloody murder. And still, the convoys sailed, because every ship that made it meant a lifeline to the Eastern Front. Without them, the Soviets would have starved and Hitler's tanks might have reached Moscow. At one point, sailors began inventing riddles to stay sane. "What's colder than death?" someone asked. "The tea in the Arctic," came the reply. "And what's black, white, and sinking all over?" "Us." That's how they coped with laughter in between torpedo blasts. By 1942, the wolf packs had sunk nearly half the Arctic fleet. Yet Churchill refused to stop the convoys. He called them the most dangerous but vital lifeline of the war. And the men who sailed them were heroes without headlines. When dawn came after a night of torpedoes and fire, the sea would be littered with ice, oil, and silence. The wolves had eaten, and the Arctic took care of the rest. Act 3. The Ice and the Iron. You could hear the ice long before you saw it. It groaned, cracked, and howled like some living thing, an ancient beast of the north that hated the sound of engines. For the men of the Arctic convoys, the ice was the enemy you couldn't shoot. It didn't bleed, didn't surrender, didn't even flinch. It simply crushed anything foolish enough to cross its path. A sailor once wrote home, "The sea up here doesn't move like water. It moves like slow, angry glass." Every surface froze, solid ropes, ladders, guns, even eyelids. Men had to chip ice off the decks every hour to stop the ship from toppling over. A few didn't ship fast enough. One destroyer nearly capsized because her deck was buried under 2 feet of ice. When your eyelashes froze together, you learned to blink sideways like a lizard just to see. When your coffee froze mid-pour, you learned to drink fast or not at all. And when your ship's guns jammed because the grease turned to stone, you learned that in the Arctic, even metal could die. The wind came at you like a whip. It didn't matter how many layers you wore,
The cold found its way in, down your collar, behind your gloves, into your bones. A joke among sailors went, "The Arctic has more ways to kill you than the Germans, and it doesn't even need ammo." One night, the convoy ran into what the log called a minal gale. That meant 60-foot waves and snow so thick you couldn't tell sea from sky. Ships vanished into white walls, their lights gone in seconds. Radio chatter turned into screams, then static. Some sailors swore they heard the icebergs laughing. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a scene from another world. One ship half buried in ice, another cracked in two, its bow sticking out like a monument. And yet, amid the silence, you'd hear a hammer tapping, someone fixing a pipe, someone swearing about a frozen toilet, someone lighting a cigarette in a gale, because that was their rebellion. If the sea wanted them dead, they'd make her work for it. And old chief engineer once told a new recruit, "You don't fight the Arctic, you survive her mood swings." And somehow they did. Day after day, they chipped, thawed, patched, and prayed. Because beyond the ice waited Russia. And beyond that, Russian victory. But between them and that dream stood one final truth every sailor came to know. The Arctic didn't care who won the war. It only cared who froze first. Act 4. The Angels and the Iron Coffins. The sky above the Arctic was as dangerous as the sea below. Down there, the U-boats waited. Up here, the Luftwaffe circled angels of death with engines instead of wings. The convoys called them the Condors, long-range German bombers that could sniff out a convoy from hundreds of miles away. Once spotted, they radioed back to their wolf packs below. Dinners served, and the hunt began. When the cry of "Bandits! Bandits!" echoed through the ships, every man knew his role. Gunners scrambled to their turrets, fingers freezing to the triggers, eyes burning from the glare of ice and tracer fire. A sailor once described it as trying to shoot mosquitoes in a snowstorm while your house is on fire. The Arctic made flying a nightmare. Engines stalled, wings iced over, parachutes froze like cardboard. And if you bailed out, God help you, the sea below was an instant grave. One RAF pilot joked grimly, "You don't ditch in the Arctic, you just change from flying to drowning." But the Allies fought back with everything they had. Carrier-borne hurricanes and martlets roared off tiny decks in freezing gales. They climbed into the storm clouds, shaking from cold and adrenaline, to face swarms of German U-88s and Heinkel bombers diving through snow and sunlight. The battles were surreal, tracer rounds glowing red against a white world. Sometimes a plane would fall from the sky like a burning snowflake, its reflection dancing on the ice below. And yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of strange beauty. One pilot recalled seeing a rainbow halo, a sundog, just as he shot down his attacker. He later said, "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and the saddest." Below, the men on deck watched these aerial duels as if staring into heaven's own brawl. They'd cheer when a bomber went down, curse when it didn't, and sometimes place bets in sardonic humor. 10 shillings says Jerry dives too low. You're on, and if you win, I'll pay you in icicles. Even the German pilots, years later, spoke of respect. One German veteran said, "We feared the Arctic more than the enemy. The cold was on no one's side." When the last bomber turned away and silence fell, you could hear the ice crackling again like applause for the dead. Then came the order, "Clear the deck, we're not done yet." Because up here, survival wasn't victory. It was just the right to fight another day. Act 5. Murmansk, the end of the world. When the first lights of Murmansk appeared through the fog, most men didn't cheer. They stared in disbelief, like castaways spotting land that might still decide to sink.
Murmansk wasn't salvation, it was survival with frostbite. Half the port was rubble from German air raids. The other half was smoke, snow, and suspicion. The Soviets greeted the Allied sailors with stoic nods and armed guards. "Welcome, comrades," one Russian officer said flatly, his breath forming tiny clouds. "Please don't wonder. It's dangerous here." Dangerous was putting it lightly. The city lived under constant bombing. The harbor was littered with wrecks frozen into the ice like tombstones. Yet this wasteland was the lifeline of a nation. The sailors unloaded everything: trucks, guns, crates of Spam, even brass bands to keep morale alive. Somewhere between the cold and exhaustion, humor found a way in. A British seaman carved a sign into a block of ice. "Welcome to Murmansk, free frostbite with every visit." Another added underneath, "Hot drinks unavailable since 1917. The Russians didn't laugh, but they didn't frown either. They simply handed the sailors a shot of vodka that could melt steel, clinked glasses, and went back to work. For the men who had fought through hell's freezer, this place felt like another planet. They traded cigarettes for bread, told stories they could hardly believe themselves. When one young sailor said, "The sea tried to kill us," a Soviet dockworker replied, "The land is no kinder." They shared more than supplies. They shared silence. Every convoy that arrived carried not just cargo, but ghosts. Frozen faces that never made it, ships that never returned. In the evenings, the northern lights rippled across the black sky, green, pink, and white curtains of ghostly light. The men called them the souls of the convoy. One radio operator swore he saw the shapes of ships drifting through the aurora. Another said, "Maybe that's heaven's way of saying, 'Convoy received.'" But peace was brief. German bombers still came. Sirens howled. Anti-aircraft guns lit up the night. The sailors who thought they'd escaped death found themselves diving for cover again, this time on Soviet soil. When the bombing stopped, they went back to work as if nothing happened. Because there was always another convoy to unload, another to send home. And as one old engineer muttered, tightening a bolt on a frozen engine, "The Arctic doesn't do endings, only intermissions."
Act 6. The Price of Silence. The return journey was the cruelest joke the Arctic ever told. After all they'd endured to reach Murmansk, the men had to sail back through the same frozen nightmare, as if the ocean refused to let them go. Convoy QP-13 was one such voyage. 15 ships set out for home. They'd survived bombings, ice, and exhaustion. Then, in thick fog off Iceland, a British escort mistook them for enemies. Depth charges thundered into the sea, and within minutes, friendly fire turned triumph into tragedy. 4 ships went down. A sailor's diary found later read simply, "We lived through the Germans, but not through our own luck." That kind of thing haunted men more than the ice ever could. They learned to stop cheering when they reached port. They'd simply light a cigarette, stare at the horizon, and ask the same question nobody could answer. Why us and not them? The silence on deck became unbearable. Even the wind seemed quieter, as if mourning with them. At night, the survivors would tell dark jokes just to fill the emptiness. "You know why the Arctic's quiet?" one would say. "Because she's counting her trophies." "Aye, and I'm not planning to be her next one." The cold was still their enemy, but now so was memory. The smell of oil and salt water lingered like a curse. Some swore they could hear the screams of lost convoys when the wind howled. A few began writing letters they never sent to mothers, wives, or shipmates already gone. Back home, the public heard little about the Arctic convoys. The mission was secret, the suffering is classified. No parades, no medals, no cheering crowds. Just frostbitten men with haunted eyes stepping off trains like ghosts who forgot how to live in warm air. A chaplain who sailed on PQ-18 once said, "They survived death, but not always life afterward." And yet, there was pride beneath the silence, because they knew what few others did, that their pain had kept the war alive on another front. Their sacrifice gave Russia time, and time gave the Allies victory. When asked years later how they managed to endure it, one old sailor simply smiled and said, "You don't beat the Arctic, you just take turns surviving it."
Act 7. The Frozen Brotherhood. If the Arctic was hell, then friendship was the only fire they had. The men of the convoys weren't bound by rank or flag. They were bound by frostbite, fear, and the kind of laughter that only comes from staring death straight in the eye. British, American, Canadian, Norwegian, they all sounded the same when their teeth chattered. Inside the mess decks, the cold crept through every seam. The tea was always cold, the jokes were always bad, and the laughter was always necessary. A favorite went like this: "What's the difference between a convoy sailor and a penguin? The penguin still has toes." Someone else would counter, "Aye, but at least we get paid in something warmer than fish." That was their therapy, humor sharp enough to cut through ice. When a man froze to a railing one morning, his mate looked at him and said, "Stay there, I'll bring the paint. You'll make a fine figurehead." The frozen man laughed so hard he forgot the pain. On nights when the wind screamed loud enough to shake the bolts loose, they'd gather in tight circles, trading stories from home. One man swore he'd marry the first woman he saw when he got back. Another swore he'd never leave his bed again. A quiet American cook, known only as Pops, used to recite riddles to distract them during storms. "What runs but never walks, has a mouth but never talks?" "The sea," they'd answer, rolling their eyes. "Wrong," he'd say, "it's me after too much coffee." Those who served knew that brotherhood wasn't just about loyalty, it was survival. They tied ropes around each other before working on deck so that when the ice claimed one, the others could pull him back. No man went alone, not even to die. A radio operator once wrote, "We stopped being crew. We became one living organism, a machine of breath and frost." When a ship was lost, the silence afterwards was sacred. The survivors didn't cry. They didn't speak. They just stood on deck, helmets off, the snow melting on their faces. Sometimes the chaplain would whisper a short prayer. Other times someone would mutter, "He's gone to warmer waters." And that was that. These men never thought of themselves as heroes. They didn't have time for that. They were too busy saving each other. One chipped block of ice, one shared cigarette, one bad joke at a time. Because when the sun finally set behind that frozen horizon, only one truth remained. In the Arctic, brotherhood wasn't friendship, it was oxygen. Act 8. Operation Deadliest. By 1944, the Arctic no longer belonged to the wolves. The tide had turned. The convoys that once crept through the ice now steamed through it with teeth bared. The Allies had cracked the Enigma codes. They knew where the U-boats were hiding before the Germans did. Radar, sonar, depth charges. The hunters of yesterday had become the hunted of today. But victory didn't come with fireworks. It came in whispers, in the faint ping of sonar, the flash of an explosion below the waves, and the quiet satisfaction that one more ghost had been buried under the ice. Aboard HMS Westcott, a petty officer once described it best. It wasn't revenge. It was housekeeping. Each kill was met with grim silence. The sailors didn't cheer. They'd buried too many of their own for that. When the bubbles rose and the sea went still again, someone would mutter, "That's for PQ-17," and light a cigarette. The Germans called it die Eismeerhole, the ice sea hell. Their U-boat crews dreaded assignments to the Arctic routes. One survivor later confessed, "We feared not the enemy, but the ocean. She was a murderer who worked for no one." By late 1944, the tables had fully turned. The Luftwaffe's reach had shrunk. U-boats limped back to Norway like wounded sharks, and the convoys, now heavily escorted by destroyers and aircraft carriers, began to move with something new: confidence. But even then, the sea demanded tribute. A single storm could sink a ship faster than any torpedo. One convoy logged waves 50 feet high. A sailor wrote, "The sea stood up and asked who still wanted to live. Only half the crew answered yes." When the war ended, over 700 German submarines surrendered to the Allies. Many were later scuttled in Operation Deadliest to ensure they would never rise again. The sailors who watched them sink felt no joy, only closure. It was like watching the ghosts of their nightmares being laid to rest. A British captain who'd lost 2 ships simply whispered, "The wolves are gone. Let them sleep under the sea." And as the U-boat slipped beneath the waves one last time, the Arctic itself seemed to sigh. The war had ended. The ocean remained silent, eternal, indifferent. But the men who had sailed her knew one thing the rest of the world would never understand. You could defeat an enemy. You could even end a war. But you could never conquer the sea.
Act 9. The Cold After the War. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most men expected warmth, parades, medals, songs, maybe even gratitude. But for the sailors of the Arctic convoys, there was only more silence. The war had ended, but the cold had not. They came home to a world that barely remembered them. No fanfare, no headlines, no monuments. Their mission had been classified for years, just another line in a naval report buried under bureaucracy. One sailor summed it up best in his diary. "We went to the edge of the world and came back invisible." Many found it impossible to adjust. After years of black water and white skies, the colors of home felt unreal. Some couldn't sleep without the sound of engines or the creak of ice. Others woke screaming at night, reaching for lifelines that weren't there. A few couldn't stop feeling cold. Even in summer, they wore gloves. A doctor once called it psychological frostbite. One sailor simply said, "The sea took the warmth out of me, and it never gave it back." And yet, life went on. They married, raised children, built houses, and went to work, all while carrying a war no one wanted to hear about. Their stories became legends, told only in pubs and under dim light. A typical exchange went like this. "You were on the Murmansk run." "Aye." "What was it like?" "Cold." And that was that. For decades, their service was overlooked. While others wore medals that gleamed in the sun, the Arctic sailors wore none, not even the faint glow of recognition. Until years later, someone remembered. The Soviet Union awarded medals to surviving convoy veterans, small red stars engraved with the word courage. One old British sailor, now in his 80s, laughed through tears as he held his medal. "It took him 40 years, he said, but I suppose the mail's slow from Murmansk." Another simply kissed his and said, "About bloody time."
They didn't sail for glory, and they never expected applause. But history at last began to whisper their names again. A journalist who interviewed them in the 1990s wrote, "They smiled rarely, but when they did, you could see the Arctic light behind their eyes." Even now, when the wind howls across the North Atlantic, some sailors swear they can still hear it. The low hum of engines, the crack of ice, and the faint echo of voices saying, "Hold the course, keep the line." Because the war may have ended, but the Arctic never really let them go.
Act 10. The Frozen Legacy. The Arctic convoys ended in 1945. The warships were scrapped. The ice melted each summer and froze again as if nothing had happened. And the sea, indifferent as ever, went on pretending it didn't remember. But the men who sailed it remembered everything. They remembered the sound of a hull splitting under the pressure of ice, the smell of diesel mixing with sea salt and death, the silence after a friend's voice cut off mid-laugh. They remembered the light, that strange Arctic light that made everything too real, too beautiful, too cruel. For decades, their story stayed hidden under frost and file cabinets, until historians, children, and grandchildren began to dig. They found logs, letters, and frozen photographs proving that courage had once sailed north. And when they asked the few remaining veterans why they'd done it, the answers were simple. Because someone had to. Because the Russians needed us. Because the sea didn't scare us half as much as losing. Those weren't slogans. They were truths carved into bone. The convoys carried over 4 million tons of cargo, tanks, food, ammunition, and dreams through a world that wanted none of them to survive. And yet they did. The supplies they delivered helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front. Every Soviet tank that rolled toward Berlin had a little bit of Arctic frost on its tracks. Today, when the northern lights ripple over the Barents Sea, locals say you can still see the ghosts of ships gliding beneath them. Dark shapes moving in formation, heading ever east. Maybe it's just imagination. Or maybe it's history refusing to sink. One modern sailor once left a wreath on those waters and whispered, "For those who froze so others could burn brighter." Because that's what they did. They froze for victory. In 2012, Britain finally awarded the Arctic Star to the surviving convoy veterans, a medal shaped like sunlight, as if to warm them one last time. Many never lived to receive it. Those who did simply smiled and said, "Took her long enough." No speeches, no bitterness, just pride. The quiet kind that doesn't need witnesses. Their legacy isn't carved in marble or written in textbooks. It's carried in the waves, the ice, and the wind that still roam the north. Because long after the last ship rusts away and the last survivor's heartbeat fades, the Arctic will remember. And if you listen closely above the hiss of snow and sea, you might still hear it. The ghostly chorus of engines, the creak of iron, and a voice whispering through the cold. Convoy continuing, all ships accounted for. They called it the Murmansk Run. But for the men who sailed it, it was more than a route. It was a test of the human spirit. They fought the ocean, the enemy, and the cold itself. And somehow, they won. If this story moved you, remember them. Like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Frontlines, where we uncover the battles that history forgot and the heroes the world never saw. Because sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that echo the loudest.